Hello, and welcome to Khyber Shards, a 5th edition actual play show set in the Eberron campaign world. It's Fridays, we've got another Khyber Shards Answers, and as you can see, this is a solo one for me. Scheduling made it easier to just do this one on my own this week. So it's a DM Q&A episode, and we've got some questions from our listeners about recent events, as well as about the campaign as a whole. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive right into those. If you would like to submit questions for Khyber Shards Answers, you can do so over on our Discord, the link to which you will find in the description below, or you can put them in comments on this episode or on a recent episode. I always go back and check those before recording these, so you can also submit questions that way. Anyway, our first question comes from Darren. Darren says, what advice would you provide for other DMs who want to give narrative control to their players when it comes to the actions and fate of NPCs, like you did with Tommel's expedition? So I had the idea for a bit that I wanted to start using different narrative techniques that we see in novels and movies, or comic books, which are a big influence on this campaign. And one of those was the, meanwhile, we cut aside and see what the villain's up to, or get a glimpse of what the villain's up to. And that's really not presented as normal in Dungeons & Dragons, so there's not a lot of advice out there for how to do it well. I think one of the reasons that it's not traditional is because the obvious way to do it is I just sit there and describe what is happening. I just tell the story to the players while they listen. And if you're a good storyteller, and I'm an okay storyteller, you can make that interesting for your players. And if your players like just listening to you tell them things, that's fine. But with this format, I try not to have too much time where the players are just sitting and listening to me. So I wanted them to be engaged. I wanted them to be involved in the story. So one option for that, and where I was leaning really up until earlier in the day, on the day that we recorded those 2 episodes, was actually having the players play out that. That was going to be our session for the night, is we would play the Stormhammer expedition into the jungle up to either the discovery of the Obsidian City or their destination within it. But I decided I really wanted to let the main story shine front and center and have this just be a glimpse. And I had come upon a few different times in my RPG life a system called the Caltrop System that uses D4s. It's not much different from the Fudge system or the Fate system that uses dice to just sort of vaguely imply how something went. But since I knew they all had D4s, but that's not necessarily the fudge dice that you would use in Fate, I went with the Caltrop system. In the Caltrop system, you just roll a number of D4s, sometimes determined by a stat if you've given a particular... if you want to get more detailed, you can give stats that determine how many D4s you roll. And then the question is, how many 4s did you roll? And that determines the level of success. So I worked out that we're rolling 4 D4s, so an average, more or less, is 1 4. And so that was going to be the level for basic success with a cost. 2 4s was going to be simple success with no cost whatsoever. And 3 or 4 was going to imply something really great happened. No 4s was a critical failure. Everything went wrong. So that was the system. It was really short and simple. I didn't even have to teach the system to the players. They had no idea that I was going to do that until we started doing it. So all I had to do was ask them to roll the dice and tell me how many 4s, and then I prompted them. So I like that system. I think it's a good, easy system. So if you want to do just little glimpses or asides in your story, and you want the players to have some narrative control, I highly recommend a system like that, or the fudge dice that Fate uses, because that accomplishes more or less the same thing. It doesn't require any teaching. It doesn't require anyone to have a character sheet, just you to be ready to prompt. As far as advice, the number one piece I would say is know how much narrative control you want to give. So I really didn't, I could have worked out what to do with it, but I really didn't want it to be possible for it to end with Tommel and the Stormhammers are all eaten by a Tyrannosaur in the jungle of Zendrik. That's not fun or interesting. And so that's why I didn't just say what happens. I provided a prompt. Tell me how they escape at a cost. In the case of the last roll that was made by the other group that was out in the jungle, it was tell me about the ambush. So you don't want to ask just what happened. You want to provide some sort of parameters for the control that you're giving them. I didn't have to say to my players, and you can't just kill Tommel or Hallis or any of the other named NPCs. I didn't need to tell my players that. If you have a group that might get mischievous about it and decide to do something like that, you might set some boundaries. If you think your group might do that, or if you think you just don't want to chance it, you don't want to have to say, well, okay, come on. And that's a little easier to do at a table than in a recording. If you don't want to have to do that, just be upfront. Say, these are the things you cannot declare to be true. But beyond that, you have control. So I would say having parameters for the prompt that you're giving them is a really important thing. Know from your perspective, where does the story that you're telling, the little aside story you're telling, start and where does it end? So we're going to start somewhere in the jungle in the midst of the expedition, and we're going to end in that tomb, in that mausoleum. So I knew where I wanted to go, and I had a rough idea of the 4 stages of that I wanted them to narrate. And all these were the things that I wanted them to know were going on. That's the other thing. Decide ahead of time what the point of this is. What is the story element that you're trying to communicate to your players? What do you want them to know? And what do you want them not to know? I didn't reveal everything in the room that the scenes ended in. I didn't reveal anything about the figure that they uncovered in the room. I didn't reveal anything about the ritual they seemed to be beginning. And I didn't reveal what's meant when Mirren says, do it. What's going to happen next? I left things mysterious because I want the players still hanging a little bit on that. So know what you're trying to tell. Know the parameters of control. The players were really quite restrained. I was really prepared for them to be, when I gave RA permission of how they get across the river at a cost, and RA decides that one of them is swept away, I was really surprised that he only went with one. So my players were very restrained, and I knew I could count on them to be restrained and to tell the story in a fun way. So you've got to have some trust with your players, and if you're worried at all that expectations will not be understood between you and the players, just make them clear right at the beginning. If your players would enjoy a full session where they get to just play something else, then play out the aside instead of just doing something like the Caltrop system. I might have been more inclined to do that if we hadn't done kind of that with the Red Ring, because Casey and RA had recently played other characters, and so switching into other characters again, requiring them to build characters. It's a busy time of year for some of us. So I didn't want to overdo that too much. But if your players would enjoy that as a break, yeah, take a break. Run. I mean, I could easily have made that a 2 or 3 session adventure with no problem at all. So if your players would enjoy that kind of a break, then I highly recommend doing that, because you get a lot more fun out of that, in my opinion, because the players are going to, in the process of that, create these characters who, assuming they survive, are now NPCs that you get to use on the bad guy's side. Also, because they're on the bad guy's side, you as a DM can really go for it. You can really try to kill them, because the players aren't going to be overly upset by character death, because these characters are, after all, villains. And you killing them in a crazy murder dungeon is all to the benefit of the main characters. So there's a lot of fun things you can do there. I would just say know the limits of what you want to reveal and know the parameters, I guess the limits of how much control you want to give to the players. Those would be the two big points. But if you want to just do a little aside, I highly recommend a very simple dice mechanic like the Caltrop system, which is what I use. The other question we got, another question we got from Eric for Philip. How often do you practice voices? Do you do it in front of others and ask for feedback, or just by yourself? I definitely don't practice in front of others and ask for feedback. I do talk in voices in my daily life. Not constantly, but I do talk in voices in my daily life. I will occasionally just switch into an accent with my students at school, with my daughter here. People who know me are not fazed by this anymore. So I do, I guess, practice in front of other people, but not formally, and ask for feedback. It varies how much time I will spend or how often I will do it as actual practice instead of just I'm goofing around. I have 3 accents that I do very well. 4, I guess, if you counted just very basic British accent. None of which are good enough for me to like pass in another culture, but all of which I do well enough to feel pretty comfortable just switching in and out of them. And others I will practice to try and get better. The only time I'll spend a lot of time really working on a voice is if I've got a character that I know is going to matter, that I know needs to have a good voice. I spent some time thinking about what Solarka sounded like because I knew before the campaign that she was going to be important because 2 players had chosen her as a relationship they wanted to have in the city. I spent a little bit of time thinking about Hular, mostly in terms of what is a giant going to sound like? Because even though Hular is only a Goliath, I'm implying size when I talk. When I talk like Hular. I'm sorry, I taught all day, and so my voice is not quite up to it. When I taught all day, when I want to imply size and depth in Hular's voice. There it is. Hular's down here. I have to sit up, find diaphragm to talk as Hular. Others, I more often, and frankly, to my great difficulty, will end up having to invent a voice in the moment. Kolos, I didn't expect to be in that scene and had to come up with his voice, and his voice has not been consistent. So those voices I often, having this recorded has been beneficial because I can go back when I know those characters are going to come back up. I can go back and remember what the voices are like. Levexi, I had come up with the voice for a kobold a long time ago, so I had that one. And I've never actually entirely been satisfied with Donnabella's voice, but that is one I've been working on. And I'm still kind of finding it. And I'm kind of hoping that by the next time she shows up, you'll all have forgotten what she sounded like so that as the voice continues to evolve, you won't notice quite so much. Other characters have gotten more distinct voices as it's become apparent they matter. Donnabella's mother, I wasn't actually sure how much play she would get because I wasn't 100% sure how much play Donnabella would get. But as the characters have engaged more with her, particularly Pog, I've needed to develop a voice for her. And so her voice has become more distinct. Harish is one I worked on a good bit ahead of time that I've still kind of struggled to keep consistent. But I knew she would be one that the players wanted to interact with. So the answer is, yeah, I often practice if the voice is a character that's going to matter, if I'm trying to get one. For player characters, I will spend a little bit of time thinking about it. For Eris on Eberron Renewed, I spent a lot of time trying to get her voice, and I tried a lot of different voices before the one I've settled on. And really, I've only pretty recently landed it where no part of it sounds particularly annoying to me, and hopefully that's also true to our listeners. So I practice voices in that I use voices quite often. I am actually only workshopping those voices sometime when I'm trying to work up a voice for a specific character, but I never do it formally in front of others asking for feedback. The only reason I would ever feel the need to do that, to ask for feedback, is if I was trying an accent that I wasn't very sure of, and I didn't want it to come across as disrespectful to people from that actual language group. So if I was trying an accent from a culture that I was really worried that I wouldn't be respectful in the way that I was doing it, I might get some feedback, ideally from people who speak something like that language, in order to get that. But otherwise, I've never workshopped in front of others. Our next set of questions is from Mia. Mia says, how do you handle interplayer conflict at the table? I have been pretty lucky as a DM in that I have always played with friends and with people I know. I've only very rarely played at a table with strangers, and in those situations I've mostly not been the DM. So in that sort of situation, I have generally not had to worry much about it. When it has come up, when a player has come to me and told me something about that another player did that really bothered them, my approach is one of two things. My ideal approach is that my players, who I don't run for kids except very occasionally my daughter, so my players are grown-ups, and if they have an issue that they need to work out, they should be able to respectfully discuss it with each other in private and work it out, especially because in almost all my games, my players also have relationships with each other. It's not just with me. So in an ideal world, my players would behave as grown-ups and go talk to each other about their issues at the table. On the rare occasion where that's not possible, I'll act as a go-between between my players. I've had players come to me and tell me something that another player did really, really got under their skin. And I have usually said, I'll talk to them about that. If there's anything else you need me to talk about, let me know, but I'll talk to them about it. And then I'll go to that player and say, hey, I just wanted you to know this bothered so-and-so in this particular way. So I just want you to be aware of that going forward. Everyone's a grown-up. I'm not in a position, I'm not like going to fire anyone unless it became really, really a problem. And in that case, because I play with a friend group, frankly, the game is more likely to end than that I'm going to kick a player out of it because I play with friends, and those relationships are more important to me than the game, you know? So it's difficult to handle. It would be harder, I think, with strangers. So I've tended to encourage players to talk to each other when they have issues. And if that's not possible, then, or if they're unwilling to, I will reluctantly act as a go-between between them and try to resolve the conflict that way. I've yet to have a game just end because of player conflict. So again, I've probably been lucky because I know that is a real thing that happens to a lot of groups. But again, being lucky and playing with people I've already got relationships with, that makes it a lot easier. And is one of the reasons I like playing with people I already have relationships with. So that's not speaking from a lot of experience, but that's my thoughts on interplayer conflict. I try not to handle it at the table. I try to handle it after we've finished playing, if at all possible. So, then Mia also asks, can you talk about the lore behind the significance of Drow Tattoos? So in terms of things that are written and published by wizards, there's not really any lore. So any lore is going to be my own creation. So Drow Tattoos, now different cultures of Drow would have different body art traditions. You wouldn't necessarily find extensive tattooing on all of the traditions, and it would be very much up to you as a DM to decide, of the 3 Drow cultures in Zindrick, do all of them practice body art or ritual tattooing or anything like that. I find cultural body art fascinating. being from a culture that doesn't have a strong, deep tradition of it, that it's mostly for personal or just aesthetic reasons as opposed to having any sort of significant culture to it. So I find it really fascinating, and I've spent a lot of time reading about it. So I would probably say that with the Sulitar, who we have only seen in brief in one of our aside scenes, with the Sulitar, you are most likely to see tattoos that are magical in nature, that are giving specific powers, and are going to be more like tattoos with needle and pigment. And so their function would be, they would be functional. They might also be religious in nature, but primarily they're going to be an arcane function, because that's what the Sulitar are all about, is about maintaining those arcane traditions of the ancient giants. The Umbridgeon, I could imagine doing tattooing, but I would probably say they're the least likely to do extensive tattooing in Khyber Shards lore, at least. But Umbridgeon tattooing is probably... I'm not sure what I would do with Umbridgeon tattooing in an actual cultural significance. The Umbridgeon are very much focused on their battles against the aberrations in Khyber, and so probably something connected to looking more fearsome in battle, or marking victories in battle. With the Vulkoridal, the drow that we've encountered primarily, and that Mia played a member of, the Vulkoridal famously tattooed themselves with scorpion venom, which, after a lengthy conversation in Mia's Twitch stream a few days ago, we came to the conclusion was really more like ritual scarification, because you're essentially using something acidic to burn a pattern on the body. And it's very reminiscent in fantasy sci-fi world of what you see with the Predators doing, marking their armor with the acidic blood of the xenomorphs. And I like that comparison a lot, frankly. So for the Vulkoridal, I imagine Vulkoridal to be the most heavily tattooed of the three cultures, because I imagine that their body markings, their body art is a story of their achievements. They are a culture that's the least formally educated. They're the least what we might call sophisticated, or the least civilized, I guess would be the right term. They're not inclined to live in cities. They're nomadic. They're tribal. And so their stories are going to not be told in books. Their stories are going to be told in oral tradition and, to my mind, in body art. So I would say that Vulkoridal tattoos could serve a few different functions. It could serve a function of identifying you as a member of your specific clan. So we've said Ilya's mask has her clan mark carved into it, the moon spear mark carved into it. So it could identify you by your clan or tribe. It could be totemic. It could invoke one of the totemic spirits that the Vulkoridal worship, either Vulkor himself, the great scorpion, or one of the other animal spirits of the jungles. So you might have tattoos that specifically invoke one of these spirits, with the idea being you gain strength of that spirit by the tattoo, through the body marking. Or three, they're coming of age symbols. So you receive a tattoo when you come of age. You receive a tattoo with your first successful hunt, your first successful battle. These things mark they're telling the story of your life. They're marking the passage of your great achievements. So I would say that the tattooing practices of the Vulkoridal would be strongly about identity. It's about the being, the spiritual world that you connect with. It's about the larger self of the tribe that you're a part of, that essential identity of being a part of a tribe that's so important to tribal cultures. And it's a record of your individual achievements. So you'd have these sort of three levels of it. It's your connection to the spirit world. It's your connection to your larger self in the tribe. And then and probably lastly, it's your personal achievements. So let's just workshop it right now. If I was going to just create a cultural tradition for the Volcori doll, I would say that when you are old enough that you're not likely to die in infancy, because that's probably a real problem for nomadic people in Zendrik. When you're old enough that you're not going to die in infancy, you receive your first marking that attaches you to a totemic spirit that your parents revere. So your parents are calling upon this spirit to be a guide and protector of you. And so you receive a tattoo very young of your totemic spirit when you... you know what? No, I'm going to reverse this. When you're very young, when you are going to survive infancy, you receive a tattoo of your tribe. This is induction into a tribe. That's what this one is. So you receive the tribal marking of your clan group. So Ilya is a young drow. Ilya makes it past infancy, and so Ilya receives the tribal sigil of the Moon Spears, marked somewhere on her body that probably varies from person to person. Her parents give her this tattoo with scorpion venom, with the venom of a giant scorpion. And remember, they revere giant scorpions, so this is not a, we've killed this and we're taking its strength. It's we're using this to invoke the spirit that we revere. So you could have different mediums for the tattooing depending on what spirit you revere. So you get the tribal marking then. When you come of age, you probably undergo some sort of ritual with the tribal druid to determine which of the totemic spirits of the world you're most connected with. And based on that, you then receive a tattoo marking you out as belonging to that totemic spirit. And so within a single tribe, you would see people marked out by Volcor. Maybe in some tribes, everyone's marked out by Volcor, and the ritual is to connect you to Volcor. But in others, you might have people connecting themselves to jaguars and hunting birds, or the tyrannosaurs and things like that live on the continent. And at that point, you are now an active member of the tribe. And so from that point on, the remainder of your tattoos, of your markings, would come from your great achievements. So there would be markings for your first successful hunt. There would be markings if you participated in a battle to defend the tribe. There might be markings if you made something great, or if you became a druid or a priest, if you became a master artisan or a bard or a musician or that sort of thing. This is telling the story of your life path, marriage, maybe the birth of children. You would get tattoos, you would get markings to record these great life events on yourself, so that as someone sees you, they can, in a sense, read the story of your life on your skin. So that was about 90% on the fly, but that might be how I would do specifically the Volcori doll in their body marking traditions. And that just sort of drawn from things I know of a variety of different cultures, not a particular one. And I'm sure you could find that all over the place. So, hopefully that was helpful. Next question. How do you feel about the Moorgrave Miscellany document? It has some great content in that it seems that it was overshadowed by Official Rising from the Last War release and the Exploring Eberron after that. So the Moorgrave Miscellany is a DM's Guild title that you can find. It was designed and much of the content created by Keith Baker and Rudy Rutenberg. It is an awesome document. It's got some really great it's got subclasses for every class in the game that are specifically Eberron in flavor, although you could certainly use them in other settings, and that's really cool. It's got some of the prestige classes from 3.5 Eberron recreated as subclasses, which I love seeing. So it's really cool in that. It's got some interesting options for some of the Eberron races, although that stuff's really very heavily overshadowed by the much more extensive treatment on the various races of Eberron in Exploring Eberron. And then it has a greater exploration of dragon marks, which I think is really great content. And in fact, the Child of Khyber racial option, sub-race, I guess, that is presented in Moorgrave Miscellany is what I used to create the Child of Khyber feat that all of the characters have in Khyber Shards. So I like it a lot. I've made use of it. It's also got some good advice on running a noir game. I'm not really running a noir game, but if I was, it's got some really great advice on ways to do that and some things you can do with 5th edition to make it more noir. It's also got an interesting, really brief plot point campaign for 0 level characters. I don't really do 0 level characters. I barely do 1st level characters. So that does not come up to me, but it's got some neat story ideas, some neat adventure ideas, so you can easily hack those. If you haven't picked it up and you're a fan of Eberron content, I highly recommend Moorgrave Miscellany. It's really cool. And it was definitely overshadowed by both Rising and Exploring, with good reason. I mean, those are a lot more extensive. But if you want some more fun player options and some cool DM advice, as well as a few little neat lore tidbits, then it's totally worth picking up. If you're a collector of Eberron material, you should definitely add it to your collection. It will improve your campaign, even if you just read it. It's got a fun list of professors at Moorgrave University, if nothing else. So I liked it a lot. Lastly, Richard asks, and I'm going to have to do this somewhat briefly, but Richard asks, how about some background lore on the Blood of Vol and the Kalashtar, at least as you can without revealing any changes you've made to said lore for the show? I can do the Kalashtar pretty quickly because we haven't really done much with the Kalashtar. I'm treating the Kalashtar more or less as they are. So long ago, in the realm of dreams, Dalcor, the spirits of that realm, the Quarry, fought a war with evil Quarry winning, and a group of rebellious good Quarry are nightmare spirits, but these are good aligned nightmare spirits, fleeing the realm and escaping into Corvair, where they bound themselves to several families of humanoids on the continent of Sarlona. Those humanoid families became the Kalashtar. And so what you are is you are a humanoid, primarily human, who is bound by your bloodline to a nightmare spirit. And it's not just an individual nightmare spirit to you, it's one nightmare spirit for an entire family. And so the spirit is sort of fragmented and diluted among your people, but it speaks to you and prompts you to do good and noble things in the dream. In dreams, because this Quarry spirit, even though it's a nightmare spirit, is a follower of the path of light. So Ezri is that, and that's the Nosheron in his name. And he's mentioned a few times, Ezri has this prompting to do good from Nosheron, even though it's not really what Ezri would rather do. Ezri would rather be a little more mercenary, but Nosheron prompts Ezri towards nobility, and there's a conflict in there. That's really the background for Kalashtar. The question, I assume, is prompted by the fact that Ezri, we've revealed, has the Mark of Death, which is associated with elves. So the lore on Kalashtar is that when a Kalashtar intermarries and interbreeds with another species, a human or an elf or a half-elf, the childborn has a 50-50 shot of being either the race of the non-Kalashtar parent or of being Kalashtar. There are no half Kalashtar. It's just you're one or the other. So I'm proposing that somewhere back in his ancestry, one of Ezri's forebears had a child with an elf who bore the prophetic potential for the Mark of Death, and Esri is just the first person to ever manifested it in that line. So that's where that's coming from. In terms of Blood of Vol, the Blood of Vol is a religion that's self-improvement taken to militant levels. In its most benign form, the Blood of Vol teaches you that true divinity comes from within. It comes from your blood, and you will have the divine spark within yourself. And by channeling that and harboring that divine spark, you become more powerful. You are your own god, and so is everyone else around you. On the farther side of that, the Blood of Vol gets focused and obsessed on necromancy. The Blood of Vol are very willing to practice necromancy because there is magic in blood. You get into blood magic, you get into necromancy, and that's where you get to the potentially darker side of the Blood of Vol. You don't have to be evil to be a necromancer, but it is true that undead in Eberron, even in Eberron, which is pretty shades of gray, undead are inevitably drawn to evil. They're inevitably drawn to destroy life because the necromantic energy that supports them is drawn usually from the plane of Mabar, which is the anti-life plane. And so undead inevitably wish to destroy life. The exception to this is famously the Undying Court of Erenol, who are undead maintained by Irian, a positive energy plane. So that's the Blood of Vol in brief. Its connection to the story is unclear at this point, and so I won't go into too much there. We have several Blood of Vol followers that have come up in the game. The Emerald Claw are all followers of the Blood of Vol, and they're a military order attached to it. But you would also have lots of Seekers. That's what Blood of Vol followers are. Just living daily normal lives. Most Seekers are perfectly normal people. The attachment to groups like the Emerald Claw and the attachment to necromancy causes the Blood of Vol to have a more sinister reputation. So that's some of the background there. What connection there is between the Blood of Vol and House Vol, as that's been mentioned. People deep into the lore of Eberron might have some information about that, but I'm going to leave those who are just enjoy discovering Eberron through the show in the dark. I'm going to leave our players in the dark who might watch this episode and not get into whether there is or isn't any connection between those two things beyond the name. So we'll have to wait and see. All right, that is the conclusion of our questions. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support the show, you can find a link to our Patreon down in the description below. We have a variety of tiers with a variety of benefits. You can check that out there. Links to all of our social media are also down there. And of course, we always appreciate any engagement you can give us here on YouTube, hitting any of the buttons down below, or giving us a comment, giving us a like, sharing us with your friends. We do very much appreciate it, and all helps the show to grow by feeding the almighty algorithm. In the meantime, this has been Khyber Shards. New episode drops this Monday. Thanks for rolling with us.